In the 1850s, William and Ellen Craft were slaves in the state of Georgia. Their desire to be free was very strong. It was rare for slaves that deep in the Confederacy to successfully flee, but it occurred to William and Ellen that she might act the part of master and her husband the part of servant. Ellen was fair enough to pass for white, but how to transform her into a young planter? She needed to dress elegantly in a fashionable suit of male attire and have her hair cut in the style usually worn by young planters. But she was beardless, so they muffled up the face of the young planter as if he were suffering badly with a toothache. But how could they register for rooms at hotels? Their planter had to be a gentleman who was very much indisposed. He must have his right arm in a sling so he could not sign in. He must be a little lame, with a nice cane in his left hand. He must have large green spectacles over his eyes, and he must be hard of hearing and depend on his faithful servant, as was common with slaveholders, to look after all his wants. William was just the man to act this part. To begin with, he was very smart, active, and exceedingly attentive to his young master. Indeed, he was almost the eyes, ears, hands, and feet for him. William knew that this would please the slaveholders. The young planter would have nothing to do but hold himself subject to his ailments, and put on a bold air of superiority. But he was not to deign to notice anybody. If while traveling, gentlemen, either politely or rudely, should venture to scrape acquaintance with the young planter, in his deafness he was to remain mute, and his servant was to explain. Where did they obtain the money and the props to pull this off? William's master had apprenticed him to learn carpentry and hired out his services. He was permitted to keep a small portion of his earnings. Ellen was a house servant, which enabled her to learn how she could escape. When she was 20, they were married, but they did not want to raise a family in slavery. The masquerade fooled everyone in the train and in 2 hotels, one in Charleston and one in Richmond. But they ran into a problem when they tried to buy a train ticket in Baltimore, which was just over the border from Pennsylvania and freedom. At the depot, the servant asked for tickets for his master and self. The ticket master said, "Of course, your master could have a ticket, but bonds will have to be entered before you can get a ticket." The servant replied that he knew nothing about that he was simply traveling with his young master to take care of him, and that he was in a very delicate state of health. He feared that he may not be able to hold out before reaching Philadelphia, where he was hastening for medical treatment, adding that my master cannot be detained. Without further parley, the ticket master very obligingly waived that old rule and furnished the requisite tickets. The mountain thus being removed, the young planter and his faithful servant were safely in the cars for the city of brotherly love. Scarcely had they arrived on free soil when the rheumatism departed, the right arm was unslung, the toothache was gone, the beardless face was unmuffled, and the deaf heard and spoke, and the blind saw. The lame leaped as a hart, and in the presence of a few astonished friends of the slave, the facts of this unparalleled Underground Railroad feat were fully established. After conferring with William Lloyd Garrison and other abolitionists, they traveled to the free soil of Boston, Massachusetts. The story of their escape was broadcast over the country, north and south, and indeed over the civilized world. But the day the Fugitive Slave Bill passed, even the bravest abolitionists began to fear that a fugitive slave was no longer safe anywhere under the stars and stripes. Now, many abolitionists counseled resistance to the death at all hazards. Instead of running to Canada, fugitives generally armed themselves and thus said, "Give me liberty or give me death." But after a close call, when they evaded capture by slave hunters hired by their old master, they decided to emigrate to Great Britain, where they were safe. Ellen could read and write, and they earned speaking fees for sharing their experiences as slaves. Frederick Douglass had also emigrated to Great Britain after he entertained John Brown at his house. Although Douglass did not assist John Brown in his raid of the armory at Harper's Ferry, and indeed tried to dissuade him from the fool's errand, he was suspected of being an accomplice. William and Ellen Craft prospered in England, although they had financial problems. And after the Civil War, they visited their old homes in Boston and Georgia. The land prices were depressed, as the southern economy had collapsed after the Civil War. So they bought a plantation with funds raised from supporters near Savannah, Georgia, where they lived with their family. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. We will be reviewing many of the stories about slaves escaping their freedom in the Underground Railroad, and there are other slave narratives. Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery when the abolition movement began. Augustine Tolton and his mother escaped from slavery during the Civil War, and he was the first black priest ordained after the Civil War. And Booker T. Washington was emancipated as a young teenager at the end of the Civil War. In our first video in the series, Harriet Jacobs sailed for freedom after hiding for many years on her plantation. We read of Eliza Harris, who escaped with her infant daughter, crawling from one block of ice to another, crossing a river not quite frozen over in the winter, with slave catchers watching helplessly on the bank. This incident inspired a scene in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that helped spark the Civil War. Harriet Tubman was perhaps the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. She returned to Maryland 19 times to lead family members and other slaves to freedom, and even assisted in a military raid in South Carolina during the Civil War. We reflect on the amusing story of Henry Box Brown, who had himself boxed and shipped to freedom in Philadelphia. And we have the tragic story of Margaret Garner, who killed 2 of her children to free them from a lifetime of bondage and sexual molestation. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.